Hi, I'm here today to talk to you about using applied behavior analysis with children who have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders. As many of you know, as teachers, we want to get these interventions started as early as possible, but we don't always have the option of getting children the interventions that they need before they begin school. Therefore, sometimes they begin kindergarten having had no academic interventions previously. Therefore, we must start with what we are handed. Children with autism spectrum disorder have been characterized in part as having deficits in social behavior skills. That means that from a behaviorist standpoint, children who are autism spectrum disorder or ASD sometimes lack some of the skills needed from the behaviorist standpoint in being able to interact with their classmates or interact with their environment in the same manner as an average student. This means that we have to teach them those skills, and the earlier we can start teaching them, the better off we will be. Now, let's talk a little bit about what applied behavior analysis is not. It is not a way to punish. It is not a fad. It is something that has been around for many, many years. Not always been used, but it has been available. It has been studied. It has been researched. It is definitely an evidence-based program. Also, it does not need to be a 1-to-1 ratio student to teacher. Many have the misconception that this is the case, and it just simply is not true. The ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis, can be used in a classroom full of students with only one teacher. All of the parts that go into getting the ABA to work have to be carefully planned out, starting with a functional behavior analysis. This just means simply that you are going to meet with a team, you are going to discuss all of the terminology, make sure everyone in your group or in your team has all of the terminology under their belt, because without the terminology being the same and understanding how to document the data that is needed for the functional behavior analysis, then every team member might not document the same data. And this becomes a little bit of a problem with the validity of your intervention methods. So be sure that, for instance, when you are defining a behavior, what I think of as a temper tantrum is a child throwing themselves in the floor and kicking and crying and things of that nature. But someone else might consider a temper tantrum just to be a child stomping their feet or holding their breath. You have to be very specific when you do this functional behavior analysis, because this is how your team is going to come up with the plan on how to get this student to get their target behavior moved toward a desired behavior, because the end result of applied behavior analysis is supposed to be getting a child to change their target behavior or their unwanted behavior to the desired behavior or the academic function that you are wishing for them to do. In my case, I have 2 nonverbal students who have also got super hyperactivity, and they never stop moving. So I would like to be able to get these 2 students to sit down and work on something academic and stay on task. Therefore, if I were doing this, I would want my student to begin with very short periods of time, of course, because my students, like I said, are very hyperactive and physically incapable of long term sitting still. So I might start with having someone come in and observe so that we can see how we might start getting that child to sit still for a few minutes. And they would document how many times that child gets up out of their seat and use very specific data so that when the team meets, we can begin to analyze the data and create a plan. Once that plan has been created, then the teacher has to follow through. In my case, I would probably use some kind of a token system in order to get my students to sit still, even just for 15 seconds for start out. And then as I begin to get success with that 15 seconds, then I can extend that time until eventually I've got them seated long enough to stay on task and attentive so that they can learn and so that they are gaining in their academic skills. I also believe that the team would benefit if we shared this knowledge with all of the staff, not just the special education staff, because applied behavior analysis, while my focus is on students with ASD, applied behavior analysis is not in any way just for students with ASD. It is definitely able to be used with any child who has some target behavior that needs to be addressed. Anytime you run into a behavior problem that behavior intervention has not worked in the classroom, then you need to start looking for what is causing that. And you start with a functional behavior analysis, because the functional behavior analysis gives you the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. Whether we realize it or not, there is always some preceding thing that has happened, action, and it might not be anything that immediately catches the eye of the teacher. So having a third party to come in and observe the classroom to gather this data is super, super important. Because once they figure out what the antecedent or what happens just before the behavior occurs, then they can figure out what the purpose of the behavior is. Knowing what the purpose of the behavior is gives you a goal to work toward, because you don't necessarily need to change the purpose of the behavior. You may just need to change the way that the student fulfills their purpose. Perhaps you have a student who has struggled to read, and every time you ask them to read, they act out. Maybe they tell you no, or maybe they get up and they tell you they have to go to the restroom every time you ask them to read out loud. Okay, so they're trying to escape from having to read out loud because they might not understand how to read, or they're embarrassed about their reading ability and they don't want anyone else to know. So they're trying to escape that situation to keep from having to do that work that makes them uncomfortable. So you give them a new way of dealing with this, and you find that alternative. Or maybe you just work with them on their reading skills so that they don't feel that way, but you reward them when they do things in the way that you want them to, or when they exhibit the desired behavior. Sometimes that reward can be as simple as a high five. Sometimes it could be a sticker. Maybe even a little computer time or time to draw, whatever that child likes to do. Sometimes we provide a consequence that makes the behavior continue or increase without realizing we're doing that. So you want to provide the consequence that is going to increase your desired behavior and decrease the target behavior. This will help get your student away from that target behavior, and the more often that they do the desired behavior and you give them that positive consequence, something that they want to happen, and you give them the alternative behavior, you teach them the skill that you want them to do instead of just telling them not to do what they're already doing. Because let's face it, if you just tell them not to do something, but you don't tell them what you want them to do, then how are they supposed to know what you want done? Like I told you in the beginning, my research was aimed at working with my autistic students who are severely affected and nonverbal, in hopes that that will try to get some control in my classroom because of their hyperactivity disorder. They disrupt my entire classroom daily. And so I have begun working with these students on those behaviors. Of course, in the few short weeks that we've had, I've not been able to see very much of a result. It can take some time. Depending on the severity of the situation, it might take more time, it might take less time. But you do have to have patience. You do have to meet with your team regularly. Once you have met with your team regularly, then you can make adjustments and change what you need done as you need it to do. Sometimes you might have to scrap your entire plan and start over. If it's not working, then it's not helping. So make sure that you go back, meet with your team, look at your data. It is very data driven. We are data driven teachers. We are in an age of data, and we must look at all of the data and collect it and use it. If we don't use it, it doesn't help us. I hope this has helped.